Right now, what I want to do is introduce our first keynote address. We're going to have two keynotes here today, right? One keynote in English and one in Ukrainian. And this keynote I'm especially excited about because I have heard so much about this man. I have read about this man. I have never had the honor to actually introduce him or to meet him. Ladies and gentlemen, we're extremely privileged to have with us today world-renowned political scientist and author, Professor Francis Fukuyama. Notice Fukuyama is a Ukrainian name, isn't it? Right? It's from very much eastern Ukraine, but he is in spirit with us. And it's important that you learn a little bit about this outstanding person. He's currently the director of the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law at Stanford University. Before that, he was the director of International Development Program at the Paul H. Leachy School of Advanced International Studies of Johns Hopkins University. Notice those are two big names. Stanford, big. Johns Hopkins, big. University of Maryland, big. Notice how we are filled with academics here. I'm sorry, I overstepped my bounds. I try to squeeze in with the biggies here today. He's a member of the Board of Directors of the National Endowment for Democracy. Among other work in Washington, he served on the policy planning staff of the U.S. Department of State and as a member of the President's Council on Bioethics. He's written and lectured extensively. So we have to be really thrilled that he's here today, taking a special trip. He flew down from Northern California just for this event. And we are honored by him being there. I'll put in a plug for his books, right? Books are important. It's important we read. His book, The End of History and the Last Man, which was published in '92, has appeared in more than 20 international editions, often referred to as the modern classic. His most recent book, Identity, The Demand for Dignity and the Politics of Resentment, was published in 2018. He is described as a person that when Francis Fukuyama speaks, ambassadors listen, and they learn. Now, his connection with UCU is not that we just brought him in and please, professor, talk about it. He is intimately engaged in UCU. We're very fortunate to have him as a scholar, as a master, to be part of the UCU family. He's taken a special interest in Ukraine, in UCU. He's traveled to Ukraine no less than 4 times. Spent the spring of this year in Ukraine, where among his many activities, he was again a visiting lecturer at UCU. How blessed our students must be to have this incredible scholar. Ukrainian UCU are fortunate to be on the receiving end of the wisdom imparted by friends like Dr. Fukuyama. And I want to especially emphasize, I brought to light the fact that, it's easy for me as a Ukrainian American, right? The name Boris Lushniak is different than Francis Fukuyama. It's different. And yet we have a common bond, sir, in that our support for academia, for education, for changing the world, binds us together. Ladies and gentlemen, give it up for a scholar, a statesman, a diplomat, and one of the supporters of UCU, Dr. Fukuyama.
So thank you very much. That was a wonderful introduction, a little bit too generous, but I really am delighted to be here. So, as was pointed out by our host, Fukuyama is not a Ukrainian name, and I think you can probably tell from my appearance I'm not Ukrainian, so I want to start by explaining why I've been to Ukraine so often in the past few years. So my program at Stanford is about democracy. We want to study democracy, but we also care about the fate of democracy. And that's why we've actually started 3 separate programs related to Ukraine. Now, how I got involved initially, I'm on the board of the National Endowment for Democracy. It's a taxpayer-funded democracy promotion institution. Its president, Karl Gershman, told me that there's this great university in Lviv, UCU. He introduced me to Pavlo Sheremeto, who is the director of the public policy program there, and he said you should work with them with some generous support from the Center for International Private Enterprise, which is an arm of the Chamber of Commerce. We launched a series of programs to train mid-career, up-and-coming young leaders, and that's why I've been going to Ukraine repeatedly to teach this course, because leadership is really critical. And in the course of these different visits, we've generated an alumni group, a network of probably about 110 or 120 young Ukrainian reformers. All right, that's the first thing. The second thing we've done is we have a Draper Hill Summer Fellows program. We invite a lot of democracy activists, civil society people, journalists to Stanford for 3 weeks every year. We've always had 1 or 2 Ukrainians in this program, among them people like Mustafa Naim, Sergei Leshchenko, Svetlana Zaleschuk. They were all graduates of this program. I'm proud to say I actually played a certain role in convincing all 3 of them to go into politics and to leave civil society. So that's the second. The third is a new Ukrainian Emerging Leaders program that just started last year, in which we bring 3 mid-career Ukrainians to Stanford University for a year, an entire academic year. So we graduated our first class. One of them was Sasha Starodubtsev, the person that led the Prozoro effort to clean up procurement in Ukraine. And so we want people that are really, they've already made a difference and they're going to make a difference in the future. And we've just welcomed our second class. Now, a lot of countries would actually like to have the relationship with my center at Stanford University that Ukraine has. And I've been asked, by people from Brazil, people from Africa, why can't we have a program for our country? And the answer that I give really has to do with the centrality that I believe Ukraine occupies now in a global struggle over democracy, all right? So I wrote my book, The End of History and the Last Man, in 1992, just at the moment that Ukraine was becoming an independent country. Things were moving in a very positive direction for global democracy. The Soviet Union had fallen apart. The countries of Eastern Europe had been liberated. And that process, which my mentor at Harvard, Samuel Huntington, labeled the third wave of democratization, was gaining momentum at that point. We went from about 35 democracies in the world to about 115 by the mid-2000s. But we're in trouble now. We are in trouble because there has been a backlash against globalization that has really taken shape and I think was crystallized in a series of events, particularly the elections of 2016 that brought Donald Trump to the presidency of the United States, that brought Britain out of the European Union. Every European country now has a populist nationalist party that's nipping at the heels of the established democratic parties, especially in former communist countries like Hungary and Poland. And in a way, what's been going on, the democracy part of liberal democracy, I think, is more or less safe. These are leaders that were elected in elections, not always free and fair, but they were elected. What's really been threatened is the rule of law and the liberal part of liberal democracy, because the nature of populism is to put yourself forward as a representative of the people, and if you're the representative of the people, you've got a personal relationship. You don't like institutions. You don't like courts. You don't like an independent media. You don't like an impartial bureaucracy. And so every single one of these countries has come under a great deal of stress. In a way, the inventor of this form of illiberal democracy was Vladimir Putin, because that's the kind of regime that he has established in Russia. It is kleptocratic. It is based on a narrow circle of cronies around him that are in politics basically to extract as many resources as possible. And that is the kind of system that is now spreading throughout that part of the world. And so it's not the old ideological struggle of the 20th century. It is a struggle over, in a sense, modern government itself versus a kleptocratic state that is really what's dividing Europe. And I think that, for that, and it's, I guess, particularly troubling because we see echoes of that in the most established democracies in the world. In Britain, in the United States, in Germany, in France, in many other places. And so the world is very different in 2018 than it was in 1992 when I wrote that original book. By the way, you can read about it in my new book, Identity, available for sale at your local booksellers or on Amazon. However, we're not selling me, we're selling Uku. So this brings me to Ukraine because I believe that Ukraine's struggle for democracy is the most important political struggle, international political struggle that is going on in the world right now, because Ukraine is really the country that is on the front line of this struggle against this kind of Putinist kleptocracy. That was the issue. So that was the issue. That was the issue in the Revolution of Dignity, and it was about dignity. It was a question for young Ukrainians whether they wanted to live in a political order that was modern, and that is what the European Union meant to them. This is a political order in which you are a public servant if you are elected to office. You are not in it to extract as many rents as possible for yourself and your family. You are there to serve a broader public. There's a clear distinction between public and private. The government tries to be impersonal and impartial among its citizens. That is what it means to live in a modern European liberal democracy. And the choice that was faced in the winter of 2013-14 was the effort of Viktor Yanukovych to drag Ukraine back in the Russian direction. And I think that these young people understood that that was going to be disastrous for their futures. You as an individual might be able to profit in that kind of a system, but the society as a whole would remain backward and impoverished, and they did not want to see that happen. And unfortunately, this was the second time that this had to be done in the 21st century because the Orange Revolution had failed. And so I think that the struggle in Ukraine is really twofold. It's a struggle in the first place about all of the issues that are really dividing the world. It's a struggle right now for Ukraine to establish itself as one of these European-style, modern, clean, democratic governments living under a rule of law. And believe me, it's got a long ways to go in that struggle. Corruption is systemic in Ukraine. It is very deeply entrenched. It is a matter of political power, and it's going to take, a big struggle to get there. Ukraine is also buffeted, I think, by the same kinds of populist forces that are hitting Europe, because there's a lot of politicians that would be perfectly happy to take advantage of, things that are popular in the short run, but disastrous for the country in the long run. And that, is something that threatens to set back the whole course of reform and keep Ukraine mired in a system that still, remains with many roots in the old Soviet Union. One of my, my immediate superior at the Freeman Spogli Institute is Michael McFaul, whom you've probably seen a bit on television this past year, the former ambassador to Russia. He says that Boris Nemtsov, the great democratic reformer in Russia, before he was assassinated on the bridge leading away from the Kremlin a few years ago, told him that there wasn't much at that point that you could do to to promote democracy in Russia, because Putin had established such a system of control and had basically brainwashed the Russian people into supporting him. He said, what Nemtsov said was, if you want to help Russia, make Ukraine succeed, because Ukraine's influence in that entire region goes way beyond its own borders. Every country in that region is going to see a positive model if Ukraine can succeed. And conversely, if Putin succeeds in dragging Ukraine back into his system, it's going to be discouraging for Georgia, for Moldova, for Eastern Europe, which is buffeted by its own kinds of reactionary forces. And that's why my center has all of these Ukrainian programs, because we feel, all of us in my center that study the question of global democracy feel that if Ukraine doesn't make it, we're all in big trouble, and that's why we do these programs for this country and not for others. It's been a tremendous pleasure working with UCU, because in fact, watching that film, I saw the actual classroom that I taught in my various visits there, and I have very fond memories of the faculty and the students that we've worked with. It is a really, really terrific institution. This, I guess, brings me to the thought I want to leave you with. So there's a question, so the thing I study as an academic is corruption and governance, and how do you get out of a systemically corrupt political system when you're mired in it? The answer to that is, fundamentally political, because the people who are corrupt don't do it because they don't understand what a modern system is supposed to look like. They do it because it's in their own self-interest. And ultimately, you're not going to fix the system unless you can generate sufficient political power to get them out of power. And that's why I've advised all of my Ukrainian civil society friends, now that Ukraine is in the process of a transition, you got to go into politics. Just like I agree very much with that admonition, all you Americans got to vote on Tuesday, right? Nothing is going to be solved anywhere without political power, and that's going to be the solution in Ukraine, and that's not something that's going to happen quickly. What can outsiders do under that kind of a situation at Stanford, in New York, in Chicago, in other places? Not a whole lot directly, right? Because none of us are actors in Ukraine. Ukrainians have to figure this out for themselves. They're the ones that have to change their institutions. What we can do is help education. The real solution for Ukraine, and this is something I feel every time I've gone there, so I read about corruption and bad governance and all of the scandals going on. Every time I go to UCU, to Kiev, to other parts of Ukraine, I come back much more optimistic, because I've met a lot of young Ukrainians that actually want a better future for their country, and it makes me very optimistic that it is going to happen. But it is not going to happen unless there is education of an entirely new, much more European generation of young Ukrainians, and when they come into their own, this country, I think, will be fixed. So therefore, I want to commend all of you for being here. I want to encourage you to donate generously to UCU. That's a great cause. It's a great university. So thank you very much for listening, and Slava Ukrainu.